The recording has started. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really pleased to see so many people. I know we are have a lot of Zoom in our life, but for now, this is what we can do. Of course, we'd rather be in person, but we really appreciate everyone coming. So I think I know absolutely every one of you on this call, but I'll just make a brief introduction of myself. My name is Rebecca Crall, and I'm the Area Focus Manager for Peacebuilding and Conflict Prevention. And as part of my responsibilities in my portfolio, I oversee Rotary's strategic partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace. And the Institute is a think tank and a research organization based in Sydney, Australia, and it has offices in New York City, Mexico City, Brussels, and Herrera. And I'm joined today by two of my very close colleagues who I work with all the time. And that is Summer Lewis, who is our coordinator for the partnership, and she's the one that makes the wheels turn on the day-to-day activities. And then Laurie Smolenski is the Outreach and Development Officer for IEP based in New York. So we are going to be jointly presenting for you today, and we're talking about, obviously, the COVID-19 crisis and how that relates to positive peace, which is a topic that we work on pretty much every day. So through the strategic partnership, we've been doing work for about 3 years surrounding positive peace, primarily in Latin America, and now we're expanding our reach through the first year after our 2-year pilot into other regions of the world. So we thought it was just a really good opportunity to introduce both the work that we do, but also how it specifically relates to this crisis that we're all experiencing. So I thought I'd start off with a question that I asked myself a lot when this crisis really started to unfold at the beginning of March, more or less, of this year. And the answer to this is really simple, and it's also complex, because of course the crisis is primarily a health crisis, but the way that we react and deal with it as a global society requires very close cooperation, and we're already seeing that where that cooperation and that partnership break down, there have been a lot of problems with the response. So this is something that we've been talking with the Institute and looking specifically about how we apply the positive peace framework to thinking about how positive peace both provides the framework of a strong society to be able to deal with crises like this, and also how we can use it in our response to crisis. So today we're going to walk you through a couple of different concepts surrounding peace building and COVID-19. So first off, Laurie's going to walk you through kind of like where we were, what was global peacefulness late last year, early 2020, right before this crisis hit. Then I'm going to walk you through a brief refresher on what positive peace is and what we're referring to exactly when we talk about that framework. Then we'll talk about positive peace and resilience and look particularly at this crisis and also how it's different from outbreaks of violence, which is usually how we talk about positive peace and resilience. And then we'll talk about the framework specifically applied to COVID-19, and we'll look at 2 brief case studies from Germany and the United States. We'll also talk about how Rotary can use the framework to address the crisis over the long term and how participants in our trainings are working in their communities right now to make a difference. And then we'll have a question and answer session. Everything sounds really good. Just a quick reminder that until we have that Q&A, to keep yourselves muted. And Summer, give me a thumbs up. I think you can also put questions if you think you forget them into the text box, and Summer's going to be monitoring those. Okay, great. So to start off, I'm going to hand it over to Laurie, and she's going to talk a little bit about where we were before this crisis hit. And just give me a moment, because I'm going to see if I can share control of the screen.
Looks like I have control. Let's see if it works. All right, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the Global Peace Index slide and hear me clearly? Great. So thank you everyone for joining us. As Rebecca said, my name is Laurie Smolenski. I'm from the Institute for Economics and Peace. I know a few of you on the call, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. So as Rebecca mentioned, the Institute for Economics and Peace is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that develops new indices and accompanying reports to define and measure peacefulness, and particularly to better understand the factors that promote and that hinder peace. So we are best known for a research product called the Global Peace Index, which is what you have here. And it ranks 163 countries and territories according to their relative states of something called negative peace, which refers to the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence. Now, if that sounds a little conceptual, it will become more clear throughout the presentation. So this is a composite index. It uses 23 indicators on a weighted scale of 1 to 5. 1 represents the most peaceful countries on the index, 5 is the least peaceful. Now, it's a bit unintuitive when it's portrayed visually. You'll see some graphs that are going down that show improvement. So just note that those are a bit unintuitive. So this index covers factors like violent crime, homicide, terrorism, and it covers about 99.7% of the world's population. And what we saw in the 2019 Global Peace Index was a very slight improvement on average by about 0.09%. Now, for those of you who have seen this data or the map before, this was the first global improvement in 5 years. 86 countries improved, 76 countries deteriorated. That was the highest number of countries to improve since 2013. When we take a step back though, I think there might be a slight lag. Looking backwards over the last 10 years or so, we see that the average level of global peacefulness has deteriorated by about 3.78%, according to the Global Peace Index. Here we see 81 countries became more peaceful, 81 countries deteriorated. And then this is a visual representation of the same. So here's that unintuitive graph. So you can see that peace has overall been deteriorating over the last 11 years. We saw declinations in 8 of those 11 years. And another data point that I think is particularly relevant for this conversation is what we call the stickiness of peace. And this is a divergence between the most and the least peaceful countries. So among the 25 most peaceful countries, since 2008, there has been on average about a 1.7% improvement. So small, but an improvement all the same, whereas the 25 least peaceful countries have experienced on average a 12% deterioration. So this is a growing phenomenon of peace inequality, whereby the most peaceful countries are generally maintaining their levels of peace and stability, and the least peaceful nations are becoming dramatically more violent and insecure.
Laurie, I'm going to interrupt you. I don't know if I, by accident, changed those slides. So you're able to control them without a problem, right?
They were sort of controlling themselves a minute ago.
Okay,
Which maybe
I didn't know if that
you.
was me. Okay, yeah, I think that was me by accident. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
A little virtual ghost.
Yeah, good name.
Okay, we're in the right place now.
Okay.
So every year, as part of the Global Peace Index, the Institute for Economics and Peace calculates the global cost of violence to the economy. So the costs associated with containing, preventing, and dealing with the consequences of violence. And in the last Global Peace Index, we saw that the economic impact of violence was about $14.1 trillion, which is just over 11% of global GDP, or about $1,853 US for every person on this globe. Those numbers boggle my mind, and they're actually quite conservative. And for the 10 countries that are most impacted by violence, we see that the cost of violence was on average equivalent to about 35% of their GDP. Syria is the country that incurred the highest economic cost of violence at about 67% of its GDP, followed by Afghanistan and Central African Republic. Now, when we break this down, you can see there on the right that military expenditure comprises the largest piece of this pie, followed by internal security expenditure. And because many of us, I'll speak for myself, have become quite inured to these figures, I think it's helpful to put them in perspective. A 1% reduction in the cost of violence is equivalent to all foreign aid in 2017. A 10% reduction would be equivalent to the combined economies of Switzerland, Ireland, and Denmark. And I think that this is important as we're contemplating how we might fund a national and a global response to COVID-19. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, I'm scared to touch anything, so let's see if I can get this back. Hold on one second.
Good.
Okay. I'm aborting control here. And I do think the reason I wanted Laurie to include some of those numbers, and I think that it's important because those are, in a certain sense, the cost of violence is kind of baked into what we absorb every year, or we don't even think about it. But $14 trillion is way more than $2 trillion, which we've been talking about in terms of responding to COVID-19. So when we think about it in those terms, like, we have to think about how much money we could actually be saving and putting into positive things instead of containing violence. So I think it is something that's important, and we've been trying to share that also with Rotarians when we do these types of training to try to, really let those numbers sink in a little bit. So what Laurie just talked about was primarily related to the concept of negative peace. The Global Peace Index measures, of course now I can't do this. Okay, here we go. Okay. The Global Peace Index measures negative peace, which is the absence of violence or the fear of violence. Our relationship and partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace centers around a different concept, which is that of positive peace. So both the terms negative and positive peace are not new. They were developed in the 1960s by one of the founders of the classical peace studies, Johann Galtung. But the approach that IEP takes is different, and I thought it was important to call it out. So the way that they measure positive peace is through an empirically driven method using statistical analysis to identify the common characteristics of countries that are always rising to the top on the Global Peace Index. So the idea is, and traditionally in a lot of, a traditional approach to looking at peace and conflict resolution is looking at why countries are violent. So this turns that concept on its head, and it says instead we're going to actually study what works and what countries are consistently peaceful and how do we emulate those characteristics. So 3 terms of positive peace that I've always tended to kind of gloss over, but I wanted to pause a moment and just talk a little bit about those, are the 3 definitions that you see here on the screen. So positive peace is the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So attitudes are pretty much what you think they are, right? They're the social views, tensions, perceptions of specific individuals within a society. So that could be opinions about immigrants or opinions about people of a different political party. Institutions is what we're talking about. We're talking about directly measuring institutional operations. So that is the rule of law or how effective government is. I'm just going to ask, can everyone mute whoever isn't talking? So if you could mute your microphone, that would be great. And then structures are a little bit different. They're not institutions, but they're the framework that is embedded into our society. So this is a little bit harder to understand, but it would be something like the equal distribution of resources. How do resources flow within a society? How is human capital increased within a certain particular society? So those are the basic differences between negative and positive peace. I don't know why I can't use my arrow to do this. This is really weird. Okay, I'm sorry guys. So as I mentioned, the partnership is based on this concept of positive peace. And positive peace has 8 pillars, which you see up here on the screen. So I'm not going to read it to you, but you can look at it on your own. Most of you have probably heard about it before. So before I take a deep dive into how these are related, I want you to look at all those lines that connect the different pillars. So we're not going to go into systems thinking today because that's a whole other webinar. But the idea is that these pillars do not function in isolation. They function as part of a system, and it's very difficult to concentrate only on one pillar. You really have to think about improving all of the 8 pillars in order to create an environment where human potential can flourish. So this is something that frustrates us to no end, because we think about how in the world can we create projects that function that address all of these. But in an ideal scenario, this is what you're trying to do. So as I mentioned before, this framework is quite transformational because it's based on data. It's empirically based, and it's a new approach that concentrates and reframes the study of peace into what works instead of what doesn't work. It also helps us measure how societies are more resilient, and Laurie's going to get into that in just a moment. It also creates an environment where a whole host of other positive outcomes are possible. So development outcomes, we call this the virtuous cycle, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, as opposed to a vicious cycle. And then negative and positive peace are very closely correlated, but we can think about peace as being very difficult to build and sustain and very easy to destroy. Because if you have a lot of violence in society, you are going to have to work very hard in almost all of these areas in order to bring those levels of violence down or sustain peace. It's easy to put in a security solution, but to actually have sustained peace, many of these pillars have to be working. But you only need to see deterioration in a couple of them for violence to rise in a society that otherwise hasn't seen that. So pretty important. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this very lightly and move my screen. Okay, here we go. Hey, okay. So along with the Global Peace Index, there's also the Positive Peace Report or Positive Peace Index. This also looks at 163 different countries and territories over 24 different indicators. So I'm just going to give you a brief snapshot of where we were before the pandemic hit. So overall, positive peace had increased about 2.5% globally between 2009 and 2018. So the last Positive Peace report was produced last year. So this is another very counterintuitive graph. So red line is negative, but it's going up. All the blue lines that are going down. So the red line going up means a deterioration, and the 3 lines going down mean an increase or an improvement. So overall, there was a 2.5 increase. That means 128 countries improved. And these were mostly associated with structural factors. So if you remember, it's attitudes, institutions, and structures. And they were mostly driven by the percentage of people having access to the internet, which is one of the measures, international tourism, so interaction between people of different countries, and then a healthy life expectancy at birth. So those are the, some of the 3 indicators that improved the most. When we think about institutions, those pretty much remained the same, no improvement, no deterioration. And where we saw the largest deterioration was in attitudes. And this probably is, when I say it, it's going to be no surprise to you because we all experience it every day. So this reflects extremist politics, rising division, xenophobia, and the restrictions on the press. So I probably don't have to tell you that that's not good news. So this graph is also a little bit helpful. So you'll see at the top, you have individuals using the internet, huge increase. Healthy life expectancy, and then you get down into the middle where you have the rule of law, government effectiveness, more or less stable. And then at the very bottom, you have quality of information, factionalized elites, and hostility to foreigners. So that is a serious decrease and not unrelated to the response we're seeing to COVID-19. One interesting point, and I wanted to mention, is that at the top, you see an increase in business environment, which is good. So you have businesses forming, money is coming into a country, but then at the bottom, you have the equal distribution of resources index, which is deteriorated. So we have to remember that just because you have increases in business activity, if those resources are not flowing equally in a society, then you're in trouble. You're not actually improving. So that gives you a snapshot of positive peace and kind of where we were before we hit COVID. I believe the next slide is a 2-minute break. So we were just going to allow you guys to stretch. I heard the other day that in order to reduce eye strain, I have to use my eyes. You can actually look up from your computer and find somewhere like out of the window, try to find something very far away. So you allow your eyes a little bit of distinction. Eye strain comes from just having one depth all the time. So, okay, 2 minutes and we'll meet back here shortly. And I'm gonna try to figure out what's going on with my computer here.
It might just be that there's a little bit of a lag.
Well, I can't change it. I can't change it with my arrows anymore. I have to use my 2 fingers. It's so weird.
Oh. Did you try the
wait,
down and up and the left, right?
Oh, I didn't do the left, right. No, I'm going, yeah, it's like not letting me. It's really bizarre, which I can do. It's just super, it is, yeah, it's just really sensitive. So I probably did something and I don't know what I did. It's okay.
Rebecca, for my section though, you don't need to give me remote control.
Okay.
So
Laurie, why don't
you're having trouble with your part right now? Or you're having trouble
I'm having to do it like a 2-finger change instead of using the buttons for some reason. I don't know what I did.
Oh,
and it's okay. It's just really sensitive when I do it.
Oh, that's strange.
Yeah.
The 2-finger, are you on a PC or a Mac?
I'm on a PC, on my Rotary PC.
Okay, I don't know what 2-finger means.
Like I have to it's the same thing as a Mac.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, the whole group is hearing my. It's fine. I'll just if you all see this like crazy slide changes, which I'm sure you already have noticed, that's what's happening. Now you know.
Well, I mean, I do know when you remote share, the multiple people at the same time can, like, if you share with Laurie and you accidentally hit something on your computer, it can advance it. That happened in our webinar last week.
Yeah.
Like it was going forward, going backwards, going forward, going backwards.
This is why we did this webinar first with our trusted colleagues, so that they would be understanding.
Yes.
Okay, so
online. You can't throw tomatoes.
I can't see everyone, but I'm gonna assume that people have stretched, and if they took a longer break, then they're gonna come back soon. So we're gonna talk about positive peace and resilience, and then get into some of the details. We're actually getting through this a lot faster than I anticipated, so we'll probably wrap up. We have till 3:15, but we might wrap up early. So, and then if you have questions, any question is valid. So sometimes this stuff is, it's heavy and it takes a lot to unpack. So we do want to have opportunity for questions, related to really anything that you guys are thinking about. So it's really open and informal. Okay, Laurie, what if I just do the slides instead of trying to share with you? Does that work?
Did you say you'll do the slides?
Yeah. Does that work? And then you just
Sure.
say next. Okay.
Definitely. Shall I jump in?
Yeah, let's start.
Excellent. Okay, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, see, I keep going.
Welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Positive peace and resilience. So within the Institute for Economics and Peace, we think of positive peace as a measure of a country or a community's resilience to shocks and destabilizing forces. And those forces could be COVID-19, extreme weather, political or economic crises. And from the data, we see that societies that are high in positive peace are more likely to maintain their stability and their they will be more likely to adapt and to respond and to recover to shocks. Now, it's quite intuitive. And we haven't produced data on the impacts of COVID-19 yet because it's so new. So I'm going to share 2 other data points that I think will help underscore this. Rebecca, could you change the slide? Thank you. So this is a visual depiction of that concept. And we found in the data that 85% of major political shocks occurred in countries with low or weak levels of positive peace. We also saw that 91% of violent civil resistance campaigns have been waged in countries, again, with weak positive peace. And then also through the data, we see that countries with high levels of positive peace are less likely to deteriorate in their global peace index score post-shock. What that means is that those countries that have strong, resilient, positive peace structures are less likely to devolve into violence, which would be reflected on the global peace index. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Oh my gosh. You guys, I'm so sorry. Let's just.
That's okay. We're just getting a sneak peek.
Light. Okay, I know. There we go.
Perfect. So this slide shows us that nations, so that there are roughly as many natural disasters in countries with low levels of positive peace as those with high levels of positive peace, and yet there's a notable distinction in the number of fatalities. There are 13 times more lives lost from natural disasters in nations with low peace as opposed to those with high peace. So what I hope to have underscored here is that it is possible to reduce the impacts of shocks by proactively building resilience through positive peace. And as Rebecca mentioned, it needs to be across the pillars. Now, again, from the data, we've seen that countries with persistently low levels of positive peace may just have low positive peace across the board, meaning all of those 8 pillars are weak. Or there might be an imbalance in the pillars, meaning some of their pillars are very strong and others show notable deficits. And those weaknesses or those gaps can cause the whole system to unravel or to collapse under stress. In contrast, strength in all of those 8 pillars lends restorative capacities that that permit countries and communities to adapt better to shocks. So that's an overview of positive peace and resilience as a concept. Can you go on to the next slide?
You have no idea how lightly I'm touching these slides. Okay, so this goes back to me. So we wanted to provide what this webinar is about, right? And I know that we do spend a chunk of time on the background, but I think it is important to be reminded of the context in which we're working. So especially with positive peace, kind of understanding the framework is important to understanding how it relates to the current situation. So what we did, and I put out a blog post, I did send it to the group. So we're not actually going to go into all 8 pillars during this presentation, but I can resend that blog post for you to look at. As Laurie mentioned, all of this is so new that a lot of the data is still coming in. So it's hard to know exactly how different countries and us as a global society, we've responded to the crisis, but we can see in an ideal world and in some real life examples how this framework could respond to a crisis like COVID. So here you have the 8 pillars, and we're going to go through 4 to show how this relates to strong societal structures. So the first one is low levels of corruption. So in a society, if you have low levels of corruption and you experience a crisis like this in COVID, you would expect that state and federal governments flow information to citizens so that they remain accountable and transparent. This also provides, the government would provide, it would already be an established trust between the citizen and the state that is really required in order to ensure that societal stress does not increase. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm gonna leave this up. Good relations with neighbors. So this can happen both at the community level or at the international level. So, I mean, neighbors are also countries, but I decided to use the community level as an example. So community organizing to help support the most vulnerable members of a community. And I'm sure that some of you have already seen that happening. More understanding and openness in the types of communication that we have with each other because of these types of stresses. And then campaigns that reinforce that we're all in this together and foster community cohesion. So for the free flow of information, we would see information triangulate in order to provide informed responses across the different sectors in a society. We would have frequent and accurate public announcements to keep everyone informed about what is happening in order to make good decisions. And then a well-functioning government would coordinate responses internally and across international platforms, legislate economic relief packages, implement new and amended policies in order to flatten the infection curve, and redirect resources to communities most in need. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Laurie again, and she's going to talk about, this time I'm going to share with you, Laurie, so you can do that.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Can you all hear me again? Great. So I have been thinking about the relevance of these pillars in the context of COVID-19, and I did a little bit of media research to see what it is that Germany seems to have that is permitting it to keep its COVID-19 death rate so low. And so among many, 4 examples that I found were very effective contact tracing, extensive testing, coordinated closures, schools and businesses as containment measures, and then it seems a relatively effective economic response. So I started thinking about what is needed for these elements and what is their relevance to the pillars. So in terms of contact tracing, this is the meticulous tracing of an infection in order to interrupt it. This requires pretty stellar scientific and technical capabilities and community cohesion and trust, so that when somebody is approached for their context and their history and who they've interacted with, they feel comfortable sharing that information. Just trying to, oops. I have some animations here. So for contact tracing, what is required requires high levels of human capital and free flow of information. Then when we think about the extensive testing that we've seen in Germany, that requires healthcare access for everyone, so equitable distribution of resources, and some sort of central registrar to record tests and to perform uniform testing and reporting procedures, which requires a well-functioning government and free flow of information. And notice it's not necessarily equal distribution of resources, but rather equitable. Then when we think about coordinated containment measures, this requires coordination across agencies, across geographies, between the government and the public. So it requires very swift information exchange, and then, as Rebecca mentioned, frequent and accurate public announcements. So free flow of information. Also trust in government. A government decides to shut a school down, that's the right thing to do. And then again, cooperation across states, which is exemplified by good relationships with neighbors. And then on this 4th point, I'm not going to try to pronounce this because I don't speak German, but I read about this German economic policy that allows companies to keep their workers on at reduced hours with their paychecks partially covered by the German government if the businesses don't lay them off. And so it's an attempt to keep businesses to retain their employees rather than laying them off and to counter unemployment. Just going to go back one. And the premise of this policy is a belief that workers deserve to be able to work. So acceptance of the rights of others comes into play, as well as well-functioning government, just the sheer ability to put these policies, to implement these policies so quickly. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying here, and my intent is not to lionize the German response, but rather to give some examples of effective positive peace coming into action. Now, turning the lens here to the US, I've thought about, in my own community, what is working well and what is not working well, or what are the challenges that I'm observing. And I'm taking a critical lens here because I think that it's important to all of our work, not because I want to give the US a hard time, but some of the areas that I've observed there to be breakdowns are, of course, the severe dearth of medical equipment and PPE, very poor coordination across states, between the federal government and state and local governments. I live in New York, and every day we read about how our mayor and our governor are squabbling back and forth. Of course, the erosion of trust in the media and the proliferation of fake news is so detrimental right now, where we need accurate, timely, trusted information. Challenges that some individuals face in accessing medical services, either because they cannot afford them or they don't have health coverage, or because of their immigration status, that they're afraid to go to the doctor to seek help. The economic inability of workers in certain sectors to refrain from working, even if it puts their lives at harm. And then the limitations that we're seeing in the Paycheck Protection Program. And so I'm not going to delve too deeply, but I think something that I would encourage you to do is to think after the webinar of what's working well in your community and where there's some gaps, and how do those gaps link to the pillars, and how in another go might we have strength in these pillars ahead of time to avoid some of these challenges. And some of the takeaways that I found to be most compelling here is that, one, so much of what we're seeing here, what is working well in Germany, for instance, is trust, collaboration, and compassion. All of this is embedded within the positive peace framework. And I think that this is a really important message for Rotarians because it's all of the things that they do so well and so intuitively in their own communities. The second thing is that this probably seems very intuitive to those of us on this webinar because this is all the right thing to do during a non-crisis context. And yet we see how these pillars become absolutely critical during a time of shock. Third, that very few, if any, countries have had sufficient time to respond to COVID-19, which really underscores the importance of proactive, sustained investments in all of the elements of society that are encompassed within positive peace. And Rebecca mentioned it earlier. Ideally, there would already have been trust established within the government, which takes years and perhaps even generations. And then fourth, that we all have a role to play. I think it's become very evident that our politicians are not in a position to solve this crisis for us, but that we all need to be working together. And it links us back to the positive peace framework because it's this whole of society approach that recognizes and really amplifies the peace building capacities of everyday citizens. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Rebecca.
I'm a little scared to touch my screen, but I think I can do it. Okay, here we go. Okay guys, I finally figured out how to not use my mouse pad, so I'm giving myself a little round of applause. So Laurie, that was great. So I think that the last point that Laurie touched on is really something that we can think about, because a lot of these things they seem obvious, right? Like we should, all of the government should be responded like this. We should have this free flow of information, but it's not actually a given. And we have seen in our own country how some of those things have started to break down a little bit. And you can only imagine we have still have relatively high levels of positive peace in other countries that are active war zones or high levels of conflict. Those things are even harder. It's even harder to respond to a crisis like this. So now I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about what some of the opportunities are within Rotary. And we've obviously seen a huge outpouring and interest in the areas of disease prevention and treatment and the disaster response, and that is 100% appropriate, and we would expect in the short term to have that immediate response be for PPE and trying to flatten and contain the virus. But as we move into the longer term response, I think that there are certainly opportunities for Rotary to play a role here, both in helping communities bounce back from the shock, and then of course trying to prevent and be better prepared for whatever is in store as it will inevitably come. So I've listed a couple of things here. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I thought I would share a couple of examples. So, and to be quite honest, these are not actually anything different than we would typically promote or support in the area of focus. I just thought I would call it out here. So increased support of domestic violence programs. I'm sure everyone has seen on the news that there has been an increase due to the stress and the containment and the stay-at-home orders that are in place. So having Rotarians support those programs as much as possible. Further support for conflict affected communities. As I said before, trying to contain something like this in a refugee camp is, I mean, a million times harder, if not impossible. So how can we help those communities, both in a COVID response, but also over the long term? This is more for all the programs people out there, but of course also for our grants people as well, but this continued emphasis on programs of dialogue and international cooperation. I know sometimes we think, what are the results of those programs or what are they actually doing? But youth exchange, the ICCs, those types of programs are at the core of what Rotary does and are very important to create environments for peace. Like international work together as we become a more and more integrated society. If COVID has taught us anything, it is about how integrated we truly are. And then the last one is, working within the positive peace framework itself. So Rotary has had a very strong focus on youth, which I think is great. That's naturally where we tend to land. But there's also an opportunity both inside and outside of global grants to work with municipal governments, to work with chambers of commerce, to use actually the Rotary network to promote this framework, to try to help adults also, and the people that actually that hold some of the levers of power to understand how we can strengthen these areas of our communities moving forward and how it relates to both exogenous and endogenous shock, which is the internal or the external shocks that will continue to happen. Probably more so moving forward with elements of climate change and other things that we're seeing. The world is just speeding up, right? So now I'm actually going to turn it over to Summer Lewis, and she's going to talk about things that we've been doing with our program participants. So Summer, I'm giving you control.
Okay. Actually, can I just have you advance it?
Yep, now that I know how to do it, I'm happy to do that.
Perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, so as Rebecca said at the beginning of this conversation, I am the partnership coordinator. It was very kind of you, Rebecca, to say I make the wheels move. I get the joy and the pleasure of helping to ensure that the educational tools and materials that are generated based on the IEP Positive Peace framework, that these are useful and understandable for Rotarians, Rotaractors, and other Rotary stakeholders. And so as part of the Rotary-IEP Partnership, we have a few different educational tools that are available that were mentioned, the Rotary Positive Peace Academy, different presentations that Rotarians can do. We also have a new program called the Rotary Positive Peace Activators. So I wanted to talk just really quickly today about two specific examples of activators that are part of this program that are making a lot of the information we've covered today, the pillars of positive peace, the entire framework, they're making it very local very understandable, and extremely applicable. So just a quick background. The activators, we currently have 2 cohorts that have been created. The goal is to create 6 cohorts between now and 2022. We've trained the USA and Canada cohort. That was in January. We have 26 activators in that group. We are in the process of training the Latin American cohorts right now, 30 people in that group. We started that training online because we had to delay our in-person training until October, thanks to coronavirus. And just to say, these activators are trained in 20+ hours of the Positive Peace framework, in understanding Rotary, and they're trained to be able to provide presentations and support to Rotarians looking to create peace projects, looking to better understand peace, looking to do something with peace in their community. So we have this whole group of activators. Any questions about that program, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to connect you with the activators or provide further information. So I want to feature 2 of our activators, as I mentioned. The first, Lorelei Higgins. So Lorelei is an activator from Canada. She is also a Rotary Peace Fellow. And she provides a really unique example of how an individual and or an organization can apply systems thinking and simultaneously use the pillars of positive peace in a very local and real way. So Lorelei works for the City of Calgary office in Canada. She's the lead for community connections, which in a nutshell, she's involved in making sure that the offers, requests, and resources related to the pandemic are connected in a meaningful way. So within her work, what she's been doing is aligning the pillars of positive peace with the overall pandemic response in her city. And she's created what's called a SOAR, fancy way of saying strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results analysis, very similar to what many would know of as a SWOT analysis. And in doing that, she's analyzing which pillars are being employed more than others in the evolving pandemic response. She's also analyzing the gaps in the current response to see which pillars are not being addressed. And then going beyond the current situation, she's looking at which pillars really need to be employed for longer term recovery plans and resilience building post-COVID-19. So as a Métis person, Lorelei, she also sees very strong connections between system thinking that the pillars require and her own Indigenous worldviews of interconnectedness. And in her words, positive peace has never mattered more. How we approach this pandemic will inform the society we live in post-pandemic. Now is the time to lead with courage and to try out different analyses and approaches, seeing where the pillars interact. What does your community need more of? What can you shift around to create more balance so the presence of one pillar can be more pronounced than previously? So again, we're really amazed with the work that Lorelei is doing in Canada in creating this analysis of her particular work and her particular city and the response there. The other activator that I wanted to feature is from our Latin American cohort, and this is Maria Julia Herrera. She is also a Rotary Peace Fellow, and she is part of the Women's Democracy Network, or WDN. Now, the WDN is a global network of 5,000 women in more than 80 countries. They have 22 local partner organizations and 2 regional networks. They're very focused on increasing the participation of women in local political processes and helping women gain the leadership skills that they need to take on greater roles in government, political parties, and civil society. So Maria Julia is a member of the Argentinian chapter of the Women's Democracy Network. And as a consequence of COVID-19, her chapter decided to develop a guide called The Participation and Contribution of Women in Times of Crises. The guide asks these key questions. What can we do now for women in Argentina in the midst of COVID-19? And how can we prepare women in Argentina for post-COVID-19 to reconstruct what the pandemic has changed? the guide goes into much more detail, of course, in answering these questions to offer very specific recommendations. And these include, for example, putting a gender lens on homeschooling, teaching at home during COVID-19. So thinking about how parents are working with their children, be they girls or boys, or whatever gender identity, but looking at what kind of messaging are they creating around that? Are they focusing more on science with certain people and math with others, et cetera? They're also looking at how to negotiate household duties during COVID-19, setting up telephone circles for shut-ins and older adults in the community. And they're also moving activism to the digital realm. So looking at how individuals can participate in virtual events that push public policy and advocacy in Argentina, the advocacy that they're doing for violence against violence against women. So the recommendations that are included in this guide, that's just a short sample, but they, in a way, they demonstrate really practical individual actions that can be taken based on specific pillars of positive peace. And these include acceptance of the rights of others, high levels of human capital when it comes to education, for example, good relations with neighbors, calling people that you know in your building or somewhere in your community, the shut-ins that have no one else to talk to, equitable distribution of resources, even within a household, free flow of information, so being able to share information about advocacy and public policy, and also well-functioning government. So how is the government responding, despite the COVID crisis, to the public policy initiatives to decrease violence against women? So underlying the guide that's been created by the WDN in Argentina is an understanding of positive peace and the pillars as core components in weathering and building resiliency post-COVID-19. And Maria Julio's work in developing this guide demonstrates her ability as an activator, as a Rotary Peace Fellow, to overlay these concepts for a national to local response with a focus on vulnerable populations.
Great, thank you so much, Summer. So I believe we have arrived at question and answer. So thank you for sticking with us. I know that the beginning tends to be a little bit heavy on numbers, but I hope that we provided a little bit of context towards the end. We've gotten a couple of really good comments and questions in the chat box. I'd actually like to have Summer maybe coordinate the question and answer with all of us obviously available for comment, but she's the best at that.
All right, sure. So the first question that we had, well, I actually did want to flag Victor's comments that came out during Laurie's discussion of Germany, the United States. And he said, it seems to me that a clear and decisive political commitment and leadership are critical to the success of the other elements. The failure of a national strategic approach impinges upon the ability of the other aspects of the response to work. So I thought that was a very astute observation.
Absolutely.
So the first question we have is from, I believe, Sarah. And it's, does the IEP index currently take into account gender-based violence? I believe I remember this not being included in the past, but with COVID-19, it seems like an important criterion to track. Laurie?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a virtual hug for this question, Sarah, because it is, I cannot underscore enough how important this question is. And the answer is no. We include in one of our 24 indicators in the Positive Peace Index, something called the Gender Equality Index. That's produced by UNDP, the UN Development Program, and it's within the acceptance of the rights of others pillar. So you do find gender equality within the Positive Peace Index. Within the Global Peace Index, there is no measure of gender-based violence or of sexual violence. And the short answer is that there's not a reliable data set that we could use that would meet IEP's data standard. And that standard is that there must be data available for the majority of those 163 countries and territories that we monitor. the data set must be the same across all of those countries. So the definition of gender-based violence, for instance, the definition and the way that it is measured and reported would need to be uniform across those countries, and then it needs to be produced on a yearly basis. So there's an organization outside of Georgetown called the Women, Peace and Security Index that produces a stellar index looking at violence against women, but it's not produced on an annual basis. So those are the challenges that we face. And it's problematic because we are putting forth this snapshot of levels of global violence around the world, and yet we're missing certain types of violence, primarily violence that impacts women and girls. So that's the short answer. And I'm really glad that the question came up because it's so important.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, actually. Just really, I mean, it comes up a lot in our conversations, and I would hope that the Institute actually moves sooner than later to try and address that. Go on, Summer.
So the next question, does democracy, in spite of its connection to many of the pillars of positive peace, help or hurt a coordinated COVID response, especially in terms of flattening the curve?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have some thoughts. Does anyone else want to jump in first?
Well, I think that sometimes the obvious question is that it hinders, right? Or the obvious, what you would jump to is, well, it actually hinders the response because democracy doesn't have the type of control per se that a more authoritarian government has. So we've seen like China was able, you know, can control large swaths of its population very easily, where you see, you know, protests popping up in the United States because people don't want to stay at home. So that might be the two extremes of the example. But I would also say that where there's high levels of trust, not in that, and that can absolutely exist in a democracy, but trust in the government is, along with other aspects, is the number one determining factor of whether or not you can effectively contain something like this. I'll hand it over. Oh,
so that was exactly my excuse me, exactly my point in making the comment to Laurie's presentation, that it's the underlying political system and the trust of the population in that system that allows you to be effective or not effective. And the two examples couldn't be more stark. In the German context, there is a leader who has the confidence of the vast majority of her population, and consequently, when she and her infrastructure, governmental infrastructure, provide guidance to that population, they respond in a positive manner. They don't have to be in a totalitarian environment where it's mandated. The exact opposite is happening in the United States, where you have an abject failure on the part of the central government to respond to the epidemic. And the result, to your point, Rebecca, is that you have at the actual support of leadership, individuals and groups of individuals protesting public policy. And so when you have a system that thwarts public policy, in this case public health, for other reasons, you have a failure in the system that allows you to support all the other pillars that you all are discussing. And ultimately, that leads to the failure of that society to address in an effective manner the epidemic. So I think, I mean, obviously, if you have a totalitarian government and you're instructed to stay in your house and your doors are welded shut, you have a more effective response. However, the counter to that is that you lose all individuality or opportunity to express yourself as an individual.
And it's also related to the ability of the government to provide support. So, you know, our health insurance is tied to our jobs, and we have very weak social systems and social security net. So additional stress comes when people cannot go to work, then they lose the ability to pay for not only, you know, nice things, but basic survival items. And so that is also very much in the equation, and it's not as desperate in other countries that are able to respond differently.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep. hard.
I loved your response, Victor. I was cheering you on with my eyes while you were speaking. I thought that was so eloquently stated. And I would just add that I think ultimately we will see that democracy is good for coordinated public health responses, even as we're really struggling here in the US. And it is true that in some authoritarian contexts, there might be specific instances in which the government is able to make people do things that would be challenging here. You know, it's great that in China, the government was able to effectively encourage people to stay in their houses, but often that comes at the expense of something else. So for every effective Chinese response, there are more authoritarian governments around the world who we see on the news beating people with sticks as migrants are trying to get to their home villages and are unable to catch public transportation, and so are suffering violence at the hands of the state. So often it comes at the expense of something else.
Can I ask, just
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
a great question.
related to that though, the German situation is a good example of good leadership, but then when you translate that to the European context as a whole, there's been sort of a larger criticism that the European Union has not been able to respond to this situation very well at all. So that countries like Italy are feeling very much abandoned by the larger structures that were supposed to be put in place to take care of situations like this at a European level. So how do you kind of balance those where in some ways it's almost like here where we might have good local responses, but at a larger context, things just seem to break down.
So I think for me, that's just an illustration of the fact that the European Union is not effective in being able to respond in a unified manner to the needs of a fairly diversified population that it's supposed to serve. And so I think what it is illustrating is that there are failures within that system that that can be corrected, that need to be corrected, but that ultimately are showing via this pandemic where there are weaknesses and where there are efforts that need to be reinforced. So I think that that's a good illustration of an international system that was intended to provide a coordinated response that has been unable to do so.
I think that the word you use, to illustrate, is a really good word, because I think that one opportunity that we didn't really point out is that this is showing us the strengths and the weaknesses, both on individual nations and also as a globe, and it can also be used as a learning opportunity to see where we can improve if we take that opportunity to do it. I know that Summer had flagged a question. I believe
we've got a lot of really great ones, and I'm just going in order, but there's one here that's going a little bit away from the research, but looking at from Bryant, how do you discuss these tracks with Rotarians, given that many of the elements are things that many Rotarians, particularly in the United States, feel very uncomfortable discussing or confronting?
Mm-hmm. Not just in the US.
This is true.
So I think that there's a couple ways to do it. I think that not every Rotarian is going to be ready to talk about this framework. I think that there's two things that I try to keep in mind and try to communicate to Rotarians. It comes from data. It's not a moral argument. It's not an opinion. So even though the positive piece, it's still quantitative. It's still coming from direct indicators. And Laurie, if you want to speak to this, you can, but it's coming from research. And so it's showing us that these are the characteristics of more peaceful and cooperative societies. And although it is ideal that you work on all of them, all of the pillars at once, there are other pillars that are less quote unquote political that you can encourage Rotarians to look into. In my experience, Rotarians are actually fine talking about this when it comes to like youth programming. Mm-hmm. When it's a more neutral venue, it's easier. What I try to push people to do, and I have been unsuccessful thus far is to actually take that into municipal government, into their chambers of commerce, into their own businesses, into their own circles. That becomes more difficult. It's true. It's not easy. Yeah, but this is one of the less political entry points. This conversation has probably veered a little bit more into the political realm because we're in a safe space, but usually it does not end up here when we're in groups with a lot of Rotarians.
I was going to add on to that, Rebecca, just to say in presentations and interactions that I've had myself with Rotarians, exactly what Rebecca is saying is to really stress, here's IEP, here's what they do, here's the data, here's how it's gathered. But then I also really try to stress at the same time the work that Rotary has done in terms of peace building since the formation of the UN all the way up until today, and really to go into stressing, you know, okay, here's all this information and data. I don't go into the Global Peace Index as much. I'll cover it, but I find that in certain audiences, if you start going, well, wait, why is the US number this? And why is Mexico, I live in Mexico, why is Mexico this? It's there, and I leave it as, this is information you're welcome to research, but going more than into, but how are the individual efforts that you as a Rotarian or within your club and or district zone, whatever it may be, what are the individual things that you all are doing that relate to this in some way or that relate to a pillar? And to try to get it more towards thinking about action, et cetera. That's my, my spiel, I guess. And it seems to work quite well because it's not political then.
Yeah. Okay, I do want to respect everyone's time. Did I say that we were going to end early? That was a lie.
No, but we have great questions.
We have really good questions. So I'd like to try to get to a couple more. And then we'll try to end at least, you know, if we're late, just a couple minutes late. So Summer?
So the next question is from Fergal. Do you know of any examples of governments incorporating the 8 pillars framework into their policies? I know in Ireland, the government agency responsible for foreign direct investment would often highlight Ireland's ranking on the Global Peace Index in their promotional marketing materials.
Laurie?
It's a great question, Fergal, and thank you for mentioning Ireland because I didn't know that. And the short of it is that I don't know a country that at the national level has incorporated the pillars into their policy, but we definitely know of some regional and some local examples. IEP has been involved with a peace builder in the Philippines who has been working with local stakeholders to incorporate positive peace into violence reduction policy there. That has been very effective. And then I think Summer mentioned the example of our colleague Lorelei, who's starting to integrate positive peace at the very local level in terms of the ways in which the Canadian government liaises with its Indigenous communities. And often people will come up to me after a presentation and say, thank you, that was really interesting. I know that my government uses these in our policy to measure our progress, but I would say that IEP doesn't have a clearinghouse of the extent to which governments may or may not be using the pillars. So that's sort of the next step for us.
I think we have at least one more we'll try to get to from, is it Laura?
We do. One thing I did want to mention, so in Mexico at least, and there's a Mexico Peace Index that's generated by IEP and it comes out next Tuesday. I do know of some state governments that have incorporated that. Yeah. So, okay, Laura, a common problem between public health response and peace building work is having a hard time quantifying what you prevented. For example, whether a program or policy prevented a conflict or the spread of a disease. Are there any lessons IEP has learned about showing impact that could be used to convey the impact of measures like stay-at-home orders?
I'm so happy you called that IEP to answer that one.
Yeah, this is such a good question. We have a really hard time measuring impact, and I look to other peace building organizations that orchestrate these really interesting randomized control trials where they're able to say with such precision, this specific intervention is what yielded this concrete impact. And we're not as well positioned to do that. So the short answer is no. We also struggle showing impact, particularly when what it is that we're trying to show is what we've prevented. You know, what didn't happen because of our effective implementation. And as we continue with this positive peace work, we are gathering case studies. So that is, I would say, you know, how we're trying to articulate and demonstrate the impact of this work. But yeah, it's a great question. We also struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that all organizations struggle to demonstrate prevention. I think that what you can do, and for all peace work, you know, within Rotary, we also struggle with this. Results are not measurable for a really long time. I mean, with water, with disease prevention, those are immediate. You can measure those very quickly, whereas interventions that have some type of like violence reduction sometimes is faster, but like building peace, it's really over a very long time. And then the prevention side is really difficult. And I think all organizations struggle with that.
And I'll just add on, this might be obvious, but I think it's worth noting, we have these years and years of data on both the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index side. So now after several years of analysis, we're able to say, this is what we know to be true and to be impactful or to be detrimental to peace or beneficial to peace at the global level, you know, when we're looking at countries. And then it's through the systems thinking that we're able to take what we know at the national and at the global level and then bring it down to the community level. And if you're interested in systems thinking, there's a pretty thoughtful explanation in the most recent Positive Peace report that unpacks that.
Great. Okay, guys, we are at time. What I can try to do is send out a little follow-up package that has, just in case you haven't seen it, the Rotary Positive Peace Academy. We do have a new version, I'm hoping by the end of this week, that you can look at the 2019 Positive Peace Report, and I'm sure Summer and Laurie will remind me of anything else I'm missing. But I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative and you learned something. And thank you for taking your hour and 15 minutes to be with us.
Yeah, thank you so much too for the great questions and for the contributions.
Really great.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.